Hello, thank you for joining us for the May edition of Forage Focus. Today's show is going to be all about weeds in pastures and hay systems, how to identify them, how to control them. It'll be really exciting. Stay tuned. Hi there, I'm your host, Christine Gelley, and today's guest for Forage Focus is the legendary Clif Little. Clif is the educator in Guernsey County for Agriculture and Natural Resources. Clif, thank you for joining me on the show today. What keeps you busy in Guernsey County?
Well, we're talking about weeds today. Yeah, that can keep you kind of busy, and I think we got some pretty unique weeds. Of course, they're more local in flavor, and those can change depending on where our viewers are at, but they could also become a problem in other areas of the state. So that's why we're going to talk about them today.
Well, it is that time of year. People are getting ready to make hay and noticing the weeds that are present in their pastures. What are some of the top weeds that we find people struggling with?
Well, you know, weeds, when you think about weeds, if I were to come to your farm and take a look at some of your problem weeds, I'd probably say, well, yeah, that's a problem weed. And I'd be asking myself, why? Because you're going to want to, the first thing you want to know about weeds, Christine, is how to control them.
Right.
And maybe you're contributing to the problem, in other words. Your
so
management.
We need to find that source of the problem.
If you don't address what's contributing to the problem, maybe it's overgrazing, maybe it's lack of fertility, if any, maybe it's those winter feeding areas where nothing's growing on, so you have an opportunity for a weed to take hold. But you've got to take into consideration why the weed's there. So you've all been to an area or a pasture or a hayfield where that manager's doing a super job. The stand's really thick, and what you find is those fields have fewer weeds. Management plays a role. So just the solution isn't always just eliminating the weed, it's attacking the problem that have put the weed there in the first place. So although today we're talking about a lot of different weeds, it's more than that in terms of controlling. You really have to find the real problem why they're there in the first place.
It seems like the most common source of the problem in our area is lack of fertility. Would you agree? That
does contribute for sure. And of course this past winter, you couldn't help but be hard on grazing lands because we came off the wettest year in Ohio history. So that's going to damage a lot of soil over the course of the winter.
So we're likely to see weeds in places that we haven't seen weeds before, potentially new weeds that we're not familiar with, that could cause us severe issues while we're trying to manage, whether that's a new problem or a chronic problem. Before we select any control method, we really need to make sure we know what weed we're dealing with, right?
That's right. And I mentioned before, as we look at that problem, that's one of the things and what contributed to that weed getting there. The other thing that you might walk up on, some of the weeds we're going to talk to you today about may not be life-threatening. In other words, weeds can be just weeds. They're taking up productive grass areas, for example, good legume cover that you want to have there. They're reducing those grazable acreage, but they could also be life-threatening. So the importance of a weed on a farm is unique to your place because you may be dealing with a weed or a tree that could potentially kill livestock down the road. So I haven't ranked them that way, but I've given you a list here, and we're going to look at some of those in a little bit that are spreading fast, and not all of them are poisonous, but a couple of them are that we'll talk about here. But they concern me because they're taking up grazable land. Livestock don't utilize these particular plants, and so that's how I kind of rank them today. But I want you to remember that each time you get on a farm, somebody's going to place those weeds in a different ranking, and many times you have multiple weeds. So we talk about an individual weed. Our first one here is knapweed, for example, we're going to talk about. But you may be dealing with 2 or 3 or 4 different weeds, and what you called me out here to talk about is not the one you should be concerned about, because you have another weed that may kill your livestock come August or something.
Right. We have seen a lot of poisoning cases, which came down to, not quite addressing the primary target, the one that might kill your livestock. So we're always accessible to come out and help our county folk do some of that ID and get the right weeds treated that are the priority. So let's dive into some of those.
Let's do that.
Our first one,
Knapweed, right? And so Christine and I in Southeastern Ohio, part of a program here to help support the control of this particular weed and several of the other plants we're going to talk about here in the segment, I guess, or next segment. But spotted knapweed is relatively new on the scene in Ohio, at least at the population that we have it today. So a lot of the weeds that you'll hear about and see about in this program, we've already talked about probably in the Beef Cattle newsletter, and that's a great archive of historical documents that you can tap into. Stan Smith in Fairfield County maintains that newsletter, and you can search that and find this weed, for example, spotted knapweed. And I would say virtually everyone in Ohio that does any traveling has driven by this blossoming flower in July and August with this beautiful purple blossom. It's readily seen along the state routes and interstates of Ohio, particularly in eastern Ohio, come July and August. The problem with this weed, although it's been in the North American continent now for about 100 years, is, well, type it in. I mean, I really don't need to talk to you much about it. If you just type in the word spotted knapweed on the internet, you're going to see that western part of the United States, they're spending a lot of money to try to keep this under control.
Why is it such a threat? Is it poisonous? Is it just crowding?
It takes over. So, and by the way, there are also examples of people mob grazing this, forcing livestock to graze it. So you don't rule that out. I don't think it's for everybody, but this plant will take over a pasture, can even take over a hayfield. It's a very prolific cedar. It's a short-term perennial, about 4 years, and produces a lot of seeds, which are easily transported. This stuff I've even seen growing in lawns. So
yeah, I've seen it too.
Blossoming at that height.
Something that's unique about this weed, I think a lot of people don't see it in year one because it kind of acts like a biennial in that it doesn't flower the first year. But it's a perennial, not necessarily a biennial. But that first year, it's just the rosette, so a lot of people don't notice it at all the first year they have it.
All you need to do, though, is when you see these blossoms now, is stop and look. You'll see that you've never seen anything like it before, because it is quite unique. Now, there's some pictures here of some leaves, Christine, and you can see that in the spring when it is bolting, and there's a lot of lookalikes.
Sure there are. It can be confused for chicory. It can be confused for Canada thistle. Some people even driving by real fast think it's red clover because the color's similar.
They do.
So, but if you look at it, take one out of the ground and take a look. It is distinctly different. The flower is different. The leaves are different. It doesn't have any pokes or spines, so you know it's not Canada thistle. The leaves aren't right for it to be chicory. The flowers are completely different. There's no other plant that has this combination of features.
So this is one, when you start to see spotted knapweed coming in, and most of the time you see it coming in from along the roads, you're going to want to start to work on it right away. And so I've expressed that you can't really mow it out. You can't mow it frequently enough to keep it out of a pasture or hayfield, so you'll have to use a chemical herbicide to control it. And there are probably a handful of unrestricted use products that you could use to control it. Call your local extension office. Kind of go over that list of products. What you need to do when you're thinking about using a herbicide is look at the restrictions first. Am I marketing livestock? Are they going to slaughter? Will I need to be grazing that right away or cutting it for hay or silage? Will I want to be replanting that field soon? All these are going to make a difference on what herbicide you select. Replanting restrictions could be several months, depending depending on what herbicide you select to use.
Right, and that's going to go for all herbicides and all types of weed treatments. You always want to make sure you're checking the label, selecting the right herbicide for your situation. So let's move into some other weeds that we might see.
Poison hemlock. We do see more of that now in southeastern Ohio.
Saw some driving over here today, didn't we?
We did, a biennial, and if you notice it, it's quite prevalent along ditches and roadways and streams, likes wet areas, and this is the most poisonous plant that we'll talk about today. And it can be poisonous, wet or dry, in hay, silage, or forages. We don't fortunately find a lot of animals that are poisoned right now in eastern Ohio from it, which is surprising to me. But it is certainly one that I wouldn't want on my farm. I'd want to start to get it under control, because if you haven't seen it, it can take over massive areas.
I think the next picture shows how large this plant actually gets. Some people can confuse this at first for Queen Anne's lace, but this is significantly larger. There are some differences. So if you see something similar to this, you know it's not Queen Anne's lace, it's poison hemlock. Now don't go out and try to pull it barehanded though, because this can give you a skin rash, right?
It does. Some of these plants do give, even spotted knapweed can give some people some rashes. But yeah, this one will as well. There are other related plants like parsnip that'll do that. But this looks like a Queen Anne's lace. I call it on steroids, right?
Yeah. Let's go to the next one and compare the flowers between the two. So there's a little bit of a difference for comparing the two flowers, but the biggest giveaway is that size.
It is, the size and the purplish colored stem of poison hemlock as well. Let's go ahead. We got to move on pretty quick based on time here. This is a new one.
Ooh, that looks ugly to me. I would not want to bite that if I was a cow, sheep, goat.
I know you worked in Tennessee. They had this there.
Oh, yes, we did. It was a challenge because this is spiny amaranth, and it will bloom, flower, grow at the height below the mower deck.
Isn't that cool? This little pigweed relative is nasty. These thorns on this thing are glass-like, so you don't really see them. First time you reach down to pull it, though, you will remember this pigweed.
Certainly.
And what it'll do is tends to take over in those winter feeding areas, barn lots, areas where you have a lot of exposed ground. And look at the seeds on this. This picture I took in June. By the end of June, this entire area up around the barn lot was covered in spiny amaranth, and the cattle won't get near it.
Well, I don't blame them.
Yeah.
Can you imagine taking a bite of that?
Not hard to control, but why not hop on it before it goes out to seed? You're not going to get it under control by doing nothing or mowing, and from that barn lot, it could likely spread into your hay fields.
Let's talk about another one that has pokey spines. We got a couple more that are pokey, and these weeds are a pain whether you're an animal or you're a manager. Canada thistle.
I guess it's everybody's least favorite, right? I mean, it's been around an awful long time, perennial weed that is a pain and certainly nasty to have in those pasture and hay fields as well. Because of that, you know, if you get that right when it's starting to form that bud, you get that herbicide translocated when it's actively growing, we have some good products that can work for you to control this.
Another one that we've got is horse nettle.
I've actually had a flock of sheep, that would be one of my coworkers, that were poisoned by this particular plant. And I mentioned the time of year. Well, it happened to be in August, and so the vet came in, diagnosed a poisoning. I was asked to find out what weed it was, and there was no forage left in August, so the sheep were reaching in and eating these berries off of horse nettle, which is a member of the nightshade family, and it killed a lot of his ewes.
Oof, that's the reason why weed ID is certainly important.
Right.
We are running out of time to cover more of these weeds, but there are some excellent resources that you can consult. Cliff, if you want to skip forward a couple slides, we'll share the websites for the beef team, the sheep team, and also the Forage's website from OSU. These are all great websites to go to and get some additional information. You can also contact Clif or I by the information available on the screens throughout this presentation. Stay tuned for our next segment that's going to cover woody perennials. We're back again for another segment with Guernsey County Extension Educator Clif Little. in this segment, we're going to talk about some of the common weeds that creep into pastures and hayfields that border forests, which is very common in many parts of Ohio. Cliff, what is one of those new weeds that we're seeing we haven't seen before, starting to see pop up in hayfields in our part of the state?
That is the first one we've got up here on the screen. And I wasn't real concerned about this back when Dave Apsley wrote the fact sheet we have from OSU. And that has been seen. This particular weed happens to be Japanese Stilt Grass. And it's been seen in other parts of the United States. He wrote that fact sheet, and it's forestry based. I thought, well, we're not going to have a big problem with a forestry weed in pastures and hayfield. Hey, it's probably more of a problem in pastures and now creeping into hayfields than the forestry area. I mean, at least it's holding soil here, but now you've got a particular grass plant that acts like crabgrass. It's a summer annual.
It does look a lot like crabgrass
It will
in the
fool
seedling
you.
stage.
When you first see it, it's coming up, emerging and growing about the same time. So it's midsummer. It's a warm season annual, producing by seed, but it is even more aggressive than crabgrass, if you can imagine that.
Does this have any forage value? Do animals graze it?
You know what? So far, I'm just starting to see it creep in corners where woodlots join pastures. So far, the cattle are not liking this plant. I've asked this year some producers to mob graze it and see if they can force them to graze it down. If not, then we don't have a wide selection of herbicides to utilize on this because it's a grass plant species and there aren't a lot of herbicides that we can use for grasses, on grass, and graze.
Yeah, it's very difficult to control grass weeds in grass pastures. There are some other woody perennials that we deal with a lot that are also very aggressive. Fortunately, we do have some control options for these. One I hear complaints about a lot, autumn olive.
It's prolific in our area. If you drive out to eastern Ohio, then you're driving by a lot of blossoms right now. It smells good, but not much good for anything else. Yeah, people need to get it under control, and if you let it go in a pasture, it's going to take over, even a hayfield. And unfortunately, you have to mow this so frequently, it'd almost be like a yard to control it. So you're probably going to end up having to use a herbicide program to control it. But sheep and goats, they will browse what they can reach here.
Yeah, I have had my sheep eat this at home as far as they can reach.
They will.
It's not very much, but it does make a difference. Now, Cliff, when's the best time to actually treat this? I have a lot of people giving me complaints right now, but is springtime the best time?
Well, that depends on what you use. So herbicides, a lot of people might treat it with a product like Crossbow, Remedy, Ultra, and they'll treat it this time of year. That's a Triclopyr 2,4-D type product. Well, you have to get entire leaf coverage to get good control of this that time of year. That's the problem. You might have to jump to a product that's approved for treating the stem. And so that's the funny thing about these herbicides. The forestry herbicides, not all of them are approved for pastures. And some of them have restrictions on the amount of acreage that you can utilize them on. And then they'll have suggestions for additions of diesel fuel or kerosene as surfactants to add to those herbicides. So those do improve the effectiveness of those, particularly when done on a basal bark sort of treatment. So you can do it this time of the year. If you cover all of the foliage, use the most effective herbicides, and you can even do a basal bark application if done properly with the correct herbicide. And most of those for grazing situations are probably going to contain the active ingredient Triclopyr.
I've seen that a lot on labels. Now, would the treatment for autumn olive be the same for Russian olive?
Yeah,
they are
absolutely.
slightly different.
It would be. So a lot of the herbicides we would use here on these brush type species would be the same. So here you have a picture of autumn olive and Russian olive comparison. They are slightly different, often mistaken for one another. You can clearly see that the silvery color of Russian olive, that's pretty prevalent when it's out in the field. Also, the berry is not bright red like you'll see on autumn olive, which will be coming out soon.
Now, birds are a big contributor to spreading this due to those berries as
Wildlife, yes, and this thing is a prolific spreader. We used to, back when I first started in Extension, we complained about monoflora rose spread, but that's nothing compared to this.
It's going to be a challenge for many people in a lot of areas of Ohio.
Frustrating problem. Don't let it go. A recent farmer who's got about 4,000 acres contacted me to get this under control. Hasn't been working with it. He's in an area with a lot of it, so you can imagine what that problem's going to cost him to control now.
It will be expensive. Another one that's plaguing a lot of parts of Ohio is something we call Tree of Heaven. I don't think this is sent from heaven. Probably the other place.
We mentioned how a lot of people, how did we get that weed, that tree? Well, here's a tree that did well in the landscape and just took off in the landscape then, and now is inhabiting a lot of areas where we really want our native species to thrive. Unfortunately, when Tree of Heaven comes in, then it crowds out all the native species, and it's a useless tree, at least for wildlife and for timber. Maybe down the road we can develop some pulpwood uses. I don't want it in my woodland, and I have a difficult time controlling this, Christine, because when you cut that tree, it wants to sprout off the root system. So a good herbicide, basal bark treatment, or cut it and treat it immediately. When you're doing that kind of cut and treat, those vascular tissues will begin to seal off quickly. Cut it and treat it immediately with an effective herbicide. And recheck, because it reproduces by seeds and root sprouts both. By the way, when you're cutting it, some people have had some bad health reactions to this particular plant. Be careful. Definitely
be careful. We want to be keeping our eyes out for this along fence rows, also in your pasture too. It can creep in there too. Something else, barberry. This is planted on purpose in landscapes. Why is it such a problem for us?
This is a sneaky little plant. It is a good-looking landscape plant. Good-looking bush in your landscape, but barberry is spread prolifically by seed. So you mentioned a couple farmers in your area who have this particular plant in the eastern part of Noble County, for example. Spreads on those hillsides, birds spread the seed, and then once you have barberry, it's got sharp thorns. Nothing wants to graze up around it. And so those woodland type herbicides, again, triclopyr probably being one of the most popular active ingredients, will do a pretty good job controlling this berry. Don't let it go to seed and reproduce. The funny thing is about barberry, it can grow almost in the shadiest spots in my woods. It can grow. So not only some of these will be in those transitional areas from the woodland into the pasture, this one can grow in the heart of your woods.
Oh boy, it sounds dangerous to me. Oh, what about this one? Calorie pear.
Oh, what a wonderful tree to pop up on your landscape, create immediate beauty. And what have we done here to the area landscape around us?
Cliff, I thought this one was supposed to not reproduce on its own. Is that true?
Is that true? Well, whoever told you that messed up, because drive around Cambridge and you'll get to see plenty of white flowers from this thing that has spread all around the surrounding areas, developed for landscape use. It is taking over. I mean, this thing is spreading unbelievably fast.
So it's another one we definitely want to get control on early with an effective
herbicide. Yeah, get it identified. It's pretty unique. Looks like a ornamental pear leaf, and that's white blossom. Doesn't last long, but get it under control because that thing's going to take off.
Sacrifice it from the beauty aspect and think about it as land preservation. Now these ones, the honeysuckles, smell delightful.
Oh, aren't they?
We don't want them around either, do we?
I do like their smell. I mean, I'm going to give the honeysuckles a slight bit of a break in that They're terrible on trees. The vine honeysuckles crush a lot of trees, break them. But hey, there's some grouse that like some of the berries. The deer like to eat them. There's a little bit of wildlife benefit to some of the bush and vine. But these Tartarian honeysuckles with the red berries, there's no use in my mind. I've got some of all of these on my own property, and again, you need to control them. They'll take over the area. They'll ruin your native hardwood species, outproduce the other native species that try to come under them. So they do damage a lot of trees. Difficult to control. So you have bush and vine honeysuckles that are both nasty plants. And like I said, deer like them, and sheep and goats will like the leaves off of the vine and bush honeysuckle.
Mm-hmm. That vine honeysuckle, you can find that intertwined in all kinds of fence in our part of the woods. Now, what are some other ones we want to cover in the short time that we have left with our viewers today? We also have a weed that's been popping up everywhere we might want to mention quick before we run out of time. Okay.
Well, you and I were driving over today, and we don't see it as much where we live, but the crestleaf groundsel, you'll notice that little yellow flower out in a lot of the fields that haven't been planted yet. That's likely what you're seeing. There are also mustard plants and several other yellow producing flowers, but this is a little bit of concern for livestock because it is a poisonous plant, and we don't want to see it creeping into hay fields and pasture fields. So at a field just recently, and it happens to be a livestock producer and dairy producer, so we need to keep it from going to seed and spreading throughout his hay fields and pastures. Do look for that, particularly if you have livestock.
A great place to go to get more information about crestleaf groundsel and the other weeds that we talked about today is to consult our beef team webpage, our sheep team web pages, our forages web pages, and I also have a section on my blog, my ANR blog, that has information about weeds and how to control them as well. Consult any of those resources or your local extension educators to help you get on a better track for management of weeds in your forests and pasture systems. Join us next time for another episode of Forage Focus.